Olá, estamos aqui com mais um Open Univesp. Estamos hoje aqui com Ioana Visescu e com Gabriel Natucci. Então, para uma conversa aqui, nós vamos conversar um pouquinho, entender um pouquinho o que é a vida e a pesquisa da Ioana. Então, a Ioana, ela é da Romênia, ela estudou na Dinamarca e atualmente faz doutorado na Islândia. Está aqui no Brasil por 2 meses aí num projeto conjunto. E o Gabriel é cientista da computação pela Unicamp, atualmente fazendo doutorado em tecnologia e estão trabalhando conjuntamente. Então a gente convidou o Gabriel para ajudar aqui nessa conversa. Tá? Então, welcome.
Thank you very
Ioana.
much.
Let's start talking about your life. You was born in Romania. Can you talk something about the Romania?
Yeah, so probably something that people would know of. I was born in Transylvania, which is a region of Romania. And I grew up there, did my schooling until high school, and I moved away when I was 19.
Okay. Transylvania, that Transylvania,
yeah,
from Dracula.
vampires and Dracula and everything else. That Transylvania, indeed.
Okay. So, and you did your fundamental school in Romania, and then you go to...
So I moved away to Denmark when I was
Denmark.
19. I started my bachelor's there. During my bachelor's, I had a short exchange to China, came back, finished my bachelor's, did my master's in Denmark as well, and then I moved to Iceland for my PhD.
Okay, you know, here in Brazil it's not usual for people to go abroad to study. Why do you decide to go abroad to do your bachelor?
So for my bachelor's, I think my parents also encouraged it. I think they encouraged it until the moment they realized I will actually do it, and then my mother started panicking a bit. But it was just for more opportunities in general, and I think I wanted something a bit different. And Denmark has a very project-based education. It's very practical when it comes to bachelor's and master's and so on, which I did think it would make more sense for me when it comes to applying all of that when it comes to getting a job or continuing life in general.
Okay, and why now you are in Iceland?
Yes.
So why another change?
Yeah. So
what are you looking for?
During my bachelor's, I said I had a short exchange, and I realized I do enjoy finding out more about culture and different countries and different educational systems as well. I think that really impacted me, and after I finished my bachelor's, I decided to go for a master's as well. During my master's, I had one project that ended up getting published at a conference. And while at that conference, I met who is now my supervisor, and she suggested it to me. She was like, would you be interested in coming to Iceland, starting a PhD there? Have you thought about it? And I was at a moment where I was close to ending my master's, close to finishing my master's, and I was thinking, what's next? Am I going for a PhD, or am I going to the industry at that point? And it came at the right time. I decided to move to Iceland. So the day that I defended my master thesis, I took a plane to Iceland and moved there and started the life there.
So you decide to go to the PhD?
Yeah.
Is this a decision for life, or you are still thinking about continuing in
we're talking about staying in academia
or going to industry?
I think I'm still torn about it. There's definitely interest from my side in continuing with a postdoc and maybe stay in academic environment. But I think I still have some time to decide, because I did work in the industry as well for some time, and I did enjoy that as well. I think it's very company dependent, of course, but I enjoyed it a lot, so I wouldn't mind either of them. I think for the way that I've been living my life so far, I'm open to opportunities. So, yeah.
So you do have a experience in industry in the middle.
Yeah, in Denmark, it is very common for students to work during their studies. So, for example, for the duration of my master's, I worked at the Lego group, the ones that make the Lego bricks and everything, and that was a phenomenal experience. It's such an amazing company, and I think if I were to go back to the industry, I would definitely want to go back there because of the company culture and the way they deal with all of that as well.
Well, you experience lots of different environments.
Yes.
What you can talk about the education systems of all of these countries? Even Brazil.
Yeah, so I think I don't know a lot about Brazilian educational systems, of course, because I've only been here for a month and a half. And similarly, I don't know a lot about the Romanian educational system when it comes to higher education, because I was never a student there. But I think when it comes to drawing parallels, for example, Denmark and Iceland are quite similar when it comes to very project-based approaches, very practical way of teaching and learning as students and so on. And there's definitely a focus of collaboration between academic and industrial or company environments. When it comes to countries like China, for example, I was there in Beijing, actually doing a semester in computer science. That was a bit more theoretical, still very, very interesting to see, and a very interesting approach, very qualified professors and everything. But I do think there is a definite difference in how they're approached. I think in Denmark there's a lot of focus put on you're going to finish the education and you're probably going to get a job in the industry, because we're not keeping everybody in academia at the end of the day. So there's a lot of focus put on bringing companies into the classrooms through different projects or through different approaches, and also sending students out. So during my master's, the coordinator of my master's program was very involved in bringing companies and creating projects based on company issues, real life issues. And also he was very encouraging when it came to students working during the master's. So it was almost kind of like prerequisite to have a job while being a student.
Okay, just one more question.
Yes.
What about Brazil? Is something here is different what you are thinking about? You are surprised with something?
So I think the courses that I was part of here was your course, of course, and I understand that it is quite a different approach than a traditional Brazilian course maybe. I find that it was very interesting to see the approach of having students take initiative and do it in a project-based way as well. From the professors that I have talked to, there is a lot of initiative when it comes to trying different styles of teaching. So in Limeira, I was talking a lot with some of the professors about flipped learning or case-based studies and so on, which is, again, very helpful for students in general. But I have talked to some professors that have expressed to me that there is a gap maybe between theory and company practices as well. So maybe it's not the most, how should I put it, habitual thing to bring cases into the university studies.
Okay, so I know you have a very interesting research, so I will now ask Gabriel to continue the conversation.
Sure thing. So Ioana, tell us a bit more about your research. So what do you do specifically? You know, hard question.
It would be great to know, right? No, so during my PhD now, I'm researching in general user-centered design and how it is better taught and learned by students. So for that specifically, we are looking at different approaches into teaching design to software engineering and computer science students in particular, and then how we can develop different skills that students can go on to solve wicked problems, for example, or to solve life challenges, to put it like that.
So your work is not only related to design per se, but more design as a tool for solving other problems.
Exactly. So it is teaching design in order to encourage the development of different skills in students.
Interesting. So you mentioned about wicked problems. So would you give us an explanation of what that is?
Of course. So generally when we talk about wicked problems, we're talking about complex problems that have a lot of different interdependencies or a lot of different aspects that play into the problem itself, which can make it very difficult to find one solution that actually works or that is a final solution, to put it like that. So in my case, I consider generally when you have technology and you bring humans into it, automatically it becomes a wicked problem because humans are very complex and development of software is a very complex issue in its own. Combining the two equals a wicked problem in my opinion.
So basically real life scenarios about everything.
Yeah. So having to design for people that have very different needs and very different requirements, I think that can be a wicked problem. Yes.
Interesting. So what do you do with your research? I know what you're trying to achieve, right?
Yeah.
So you're trying to solve these wicked problems, but how do we approach it? Like, what's the role of the researcher in that position? You know, what do you do to achieve that?
Yeah. So just to put that out there, generally wicked problems can't be solved in the way that we solve like a math problem and so on. And when I say wicked problems, we're also thinking big scale, for example, climate change or very different human issues. But, you know, I'm taking that at a way smaller scale over here. So when it comes to our approach is introducing a model into the classroom. It's called the UCD sprint. Design sprints are something that, from my understanding, came from the Google Ventures area, and it's like a model of design that moves into a very fast into a very short period of time, very constricted to different steps. So we have introduced that to the students in Reykjavik University in Iceland, and we've done some studies in Italy as well. It's being taught in Finland. Now a version of it is in Brazil as well. So we're trying to get feedback on this model that we're introducing in order to optimize it for the students, so they can leave the benches of university with the best possible mix of soft and hard skills that can make them more employable or simply just better in life, to put it like that.
Interesting. So do you see this model being applied in other places rather than software engineering then? Because right now you're applying it to software engineering, right? Yeah. So do you see it being applied in different areas or even different courses?
Yeah, so the different types of courses that we've taught were all in different areas. So in Brazil here, it's like a combination of a game development model that you have created,
right.
and the UCD sprint. But in Italy, for example, it was taught to people from the industry for them to be able to use it in company settings. And in Finland, as far as I know, it's taught in a different format, but similar steps. So I think while it is design related, it can be used for a lot more than just software engineering courses in university. So I think parts of it at least can be applied to product design as well, or any type of design at the end of the day. But of course it needs to be adapted to those specific scenarios.
Of course, so it's not ready as is, right? Because you're still researching it, but I see it more like a problem-solving approach, right? So it's more of solving things that can be done despite software engineering by itself, right?
Yes.
So that's,
I also think it's important to know that it's not something that will, in my opinion at least, hopefully I'll finish this PhD quite soon, but I don't think it's something as a process that will ever be final and we're not iterating it anymore. Because at the end of the day, the whole point of it is adapting it to students' needs. And just as the industry changes, the students change as well, and the needs that they have for entering the industry and being employable will change. So we want the process to be adapted to that, of course.
Interesting. And how do you see the different audiences? So you mentioned that we're professionals who try this out. So students here from Brazil, students from other countries. So do you think there's a cultural approach to that, or is culture a factor in this model? So what do you think about that? Like, do different people from different countries use this differently? Yeah,
so I think I'm quite early in the process of expanding it internationally to be able to give you a definite answer for that. But I have noticed, so in order to be better able to adapt it, I've also done some interviews with the industry and also collected feedback after teaching it and so on and so forth. I think a lot of the feedback that we're getting is, for example, Iceland is it's a very small country. So we were talking about how Iceland has the population of Limeira at the end of the day, like the entire country. So it is very easy to convince people to try stuff out. You know, when we're talking a population the size of Brazil, that's a bit more complicated, you know, and the type of software that's produced here and so on. But I also think there's a matter of what is seen as a priority. So for example, in Italy, some of the feedback that we got there was, initially we've run some interviews with some companies, and some of the feedback we got was, oh, we don't use a lot of user-centered design approaches because they're expensive and they take time, and we don't have that in companies here. But once the professionals have learned the methodology, or to put it better, the toolbox that the UCD Sprint is, they had a lot of positive feedback on it. So there was a lot of, oh, actually, it's not as difficult as we thought it would be. So we would definitely like to bring this to the company and implement at least some parts of it into the industry. And I've noticed from the people I talked to in Brazil here as well, there's a bit of a lag behind when it comes to research, to user research or user experience research. There's a lot of, we're doing things and then we're checking if they work or not, like just testing it at the end instead of doing user research at the beginning and then implementing it. So that is something that is coming from my understanding, but it's a bit slower.
Yeah, I think in Brazil at least we do have that approach. So we think about requirements first, and then we move on to the user to see if there's a user for what we build.
Exactly.
Right? So that's kind of a weird approach to take, but I feel that in some regions here we do have the user-centered approach. So that's why we decided to adapt the model to the game environment, because from what I've seen in the game industry here in Brazil, so the developers there tend to do that. So they tend to look at the user first. So sometimes, of course, we think about a game mechanic and, you know, it's fun, we need to develop this. But other times we do see the impact in the player, and we do a lot of play testing, right? So testing with the user. So I think that approach would fit perfectly in this case. And that's why we did all this collaboration together, right? So can you talk a little bit more about that? So how was the adaptation of the UCD Sprint to the game environment that we did here in Brazil? So what do you think of it? So good points, bad points. So what's your opinion about that?
Yes.
Please, can you explain first what was the experience we have here in Brazil? First of all, what is your research and what are you doing with this, what you intend to do with this research, and then she answers.
Of course. So a bit of background. So I'm a computer scientist myself. I work, generally speaking, with artificial intelligence. But in the recent years, I got involved in the game design industry as well. So I got to design different sorts of games. We even won some awards with a game that we designed together. And that led me to my current doctoral research that involves particularly games and game design, or basically how to develop a game that will evoke a particular emotion. So that's the whole idea behind it. There's a ton of research that explains that when we feel something, we generally learn better. So we can learn better some traditional school content, but we also could learn life lessons, or we could learn, you know, economical lessons. So things that goes beyond the classroom. So that's why I got involved in this project, and basically how I got involved in games in general is how can we evoke certain emotions that will drive the player to learn something from it. So can we teach economics on a game and make the user or the player feels joy while playing it? Like, you know, it's not a serious game in the bad term, right? So it's not something that we play with sign like, oh, okay, I have to play this again just to learn about it. So that's the whole thing about the research. That's what we're trying to achieve, how to maximize our learning through emotions, and particularly through games. And that's why we got involved with Ioana, particularly because of the UCD Sprint that fits perfectly into this environment. So she's trying to answer the question of how do we solve difficult problems. And this is certainly one difficult problem, how to evoke emotions and learn at the same time and make the experience good for the player. So that's what we're trying to do right now. So that's why we got involved with this. And we adapted the model here in Brazil. We applied in some classrooms, so a very project-based approach. So the students got to fiddle around with the model, try this out a little bit, design their own games with a particular focus, either simply fun or learn something, right? So we got some economical games, financial games there. We got some educational games. So we are still in development in terms of these types of games. But the results were quite good, at least in my opinion. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think of it? So after this whole experience, so what are your thoughts about that? How was the adaptation? How were the student feedback that we got here in Brazil?
So I think it's fair to say that the adaptation kept true to the initial idea of the model of like getting to know who you're developing for or who you're designing for and so on. So that was a huge plus in my opinion. I think it was also a matter of, it's not something that I've done before. So I've worked a bit with more gamified learning experiences, but that was during my master's and not to the extent of like, let's give each student their own small project. And I do think the fact that we kept it to a project-based approach gave them the opportunity to have a complete experience. So carrying something from one end to the other, that also gives them the responsibility over it and the ownership, which is phenomenal for students in my opinion. But I did have some surprises as well, like some parts of the process itself were surprising when it came to student feedback. So we had some parts of the initial design process where we were not sure, either of us at the end of the day, if they will find it useful. And of course there was like a mixed feedback from their side, but a lot of them really loved the process, and I think a lot of them really found it useful. And the prototypes that I've seen from that came from this model were mind-blowing. The fact that these are bachelor students and they did some pretty impressive designs and they carried through into an actual game was impressive in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. So the end result were amazing.
Yeah.
for what we did. So we did just this one course, right? So if they had more time or maybe they weren't taking other classes, the results would be even more amazing.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting. So. Can you walk us through a little bit about what the process is about the UCD sprint? So how do we use it?
Yeah.
You know, what's the first step, second step on a high level, of course.
So I'm not going to walk you through all the 18 steps I think we're at the moment. But the original one has 3 phases in which you get to go through the entire process, from discovering who your user is and what they want and what their needs are and maybe things they haven't thought about or you can deduct from. So in that aspect, we have interviews, we have user goals, we have something that is similar to the game development part where we're talking about the experience we want the users to have while they're using the software. And then we're walking into the design phase, into the part where we're actually putting down on paper some components or some parts of the design. And then we're walking into something that is called the reality check, which is when you actually get to test it, when you actually get to see if it works or it doesn't work. Because before that, you are connected to the user and their needs, but at the end of the day, having a more or less finished prototype, presenting it to the users and getting direct feedback on that is a different experience. And we see that in how students approach it as well, because at the end, they're always like, oh, we didn't think about that. And it's always the same feedback that we get, that most of them, even in software engineering or computer science or any type of these STEM-related fields, to put like that, generally, at least in Iceland, in Denmark and so on, they are tested on real sciences. So they don't have a lot of need to develop other soft skills, for example. So when you put them in front of the idea of, okay, get to know who you're developing for, develop some sort of relationship with what type of project you're making at the end of the day, and then you walk them through the entire process. First of all, the structure benefits the students a lot, because it is very daunting to be put in front of a project and be like, okay, now do something with it, you know?
Right.
So I think they, picking it up from the beginning, having, okay, this is step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on and so forth, is very useful, but also having the opportunity of seeing a semi-finished product at the end of it. It's just like, oh, I made that. There's the ownership over it, and there's they're allowed to feel proud about it most of the time. Most of the time, it's very good work. That's what I'm saying. So it becomes a lot more doable, what they see, because a lot of times having the idea of designing software from one end to the other it's a bit of a dark cloud there. It's like, I don't know what happens, and I'm not that interested in it maybe. And at the end, they're like, oh, this was extremely useful and extremely satisfying to see from one end to the other. So I think putting that in perspective like that is very useful for students. And that's the feedback we've received so far, at least. We're still working on it and ways of teaching it. But I think we also approach it in an active learning, problem-based learning and so on, which is very useful for them in general, and the knowledge gain is quite substantial when it comes to them doing something on their own and not being on the benches of university being talked to like during four hours or something like that, and then you go home and nothing actually stuck, you know. So yeah.
So I got one more question for you. So you mentioned about the experience, right? So that relates a lot to my research, because for me, emotions and experience, they kind of come together in a bundle, right? So what's the role of the experience in the UCD sprint, or the methodology that you developed, and why is it important to take that into account? You know, because we could just as easily create a product and ask the user if it's okay or not without experience involved or emotions involved in there. So what do you think about this role, and why is it important to research that?
So clarifying here, are we talking about the user experience that we want the students to learn?
The experience step.
Yeah. So in that case, I think it's important to mention that there's a lot of software developed that is tested at the end and works out, and that's phenomenal. But we also see a lot of software fail and so on, and it is one of the primary reasons of software failure, like the bad user experience. And I think it's great to be able to convince students from the beginning that this is something important. And it is important because, for example, we have issues as accessibility, which we have, I don't know, 7-8% of men are colorblind. So it's one of those things where you need to take that into consideration when you design, especially when we talk like games and so on. And I think it's even going further, we have struggles that people go through when they're trying to use the software. It's not just accessibility-wise, but also when it comes to simply the experience that they get from it. So of course, I'm not going to want to use a software that doesn't cater to me or that is painful to use, you know, like mentally, of course. And if you let the students go through university without teaching all of this, and then they reach the industry, and in the industry there's never enough time or enough money to upskill or to convince people to do that. If they already have the toolkit for it, it's very easy for them to enter the industry and be like, okay, I've learned these 5 methods, I've learned this, I don't know how many methods, let's improve the user experience overall. And it does also have to do with the fact that this is a 18-step process at the end of the day, but we want the students to understand that it's better to fail at the beginning than to fail after you've invested everything in this. Because if you test it at the end only, then if the project doesn't work, what are you doing? Right. You know, you've already invested the time and the money in it. If you figure out that the users don't want this from the beginning, well, you can save the investment, use it on something else, or modify it so it actually works out. So the user experience is very important in the idea of failing fast and failing early, to put it like that.
So how do you see the students taking that? Because at least culturally speaking, I think in Brazil we still have, we're struggling with this model, because we sometimes see here failure or as, you know, a end stop. So if you fail, that's it, you fail. So you can't start over, you can't do it again. It's not part of the process, it's the end of it, right?
Yeah.
But what the user-centered design in general and your sprint tells us is that it's the opposite, right?
Yeah.
It's the start of something.
It's part of the process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do you feel the students taking it, you know? So do they clash with it in some sense, or?
So not necessarily. We've seen, of course, students have a bit of an issue. It's just like, well, it didn't work out, now what? You know, but it's great to encourage them, okay, you failed, pick it back up and do it differently, or try it in a different way. And it's also tied with the idea of ownership. You know, it's yours, carry it through one way or another, like make it better, improve it, and then finish it up. I think it's very important to encourage students to, or allow students to fail when they need to. You know, it's part of the process, and they learn a lot from failing at the beginning. Because if they didn't fail at all during the project, like, okay, it could have been done without the first part, for example. But if you fail in the first part, then you realize, oh, actually, this is very valuable. This is something that makes sense. So we've seen a lot of them start the interviewing process with the users, for example, and realize, oh, actually, we've been told that the idea we had didn't make any sense, or nobody wants it, or the idea we had of how we would design it was completely disproportionate when it comes to what users actually wanted. And then at the beginning, you get the chance to tweak it,
Right.
you know, or go with a different idea if it's that bad.
Yeah, so I think testing early kind of removes the weight of it, right?
Yeah.
So you can fail and it's not a big deal because
Yes.
there's so little developed, right?
You fail on a small level,
Yeah.
you know, because if you fail on a big level, then it feels a lot more burdensome, you know, it just,
Right,
yeah.
right. That's good. Yeah, that's the experience that we have with the students, right? So when we teach this at the course, they were skeptical at first with the interviews, but at the end of it, they were really glad it happened, you know, because it allowed them to pivot and do different things. So that's interesting. Yeah.
And looking at the results we got from the feedback sessions, it seems like they ranked the interviews quite high on their priority list or on things they want to take further into their education or into their professional lives, hopefully.
That's really good. Yeah. So I'm just reminding of something also in the methodology. So we're talking about design as a whole, right? So your work right now is mainly focused on software development, but we have collaborating in the game design industry as well.
Yeah.
But is the process only digital? Is there something that can be applied in the physical form? So how is the design process in general? Because we're talking about something that's highly abstract, right? So we're talking about software, we're talking about games that lives in the computer, but do we take it with our own hands? So that's one thing that I wanted to ask you. Yeah.
So are we talking the applicability of the model itself?
Actually, about the step that
the steps. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you're leading into probably the main step that we got a lot of comments on here in Brazil in the game development part, which is a paper prototype, which is in some people's opinions a bit old school, to put it like that. So we encourage the students as part of the process to go not only into a prototype that's digital, but start with producing and testing on a paper prototype, which can be more or less a sketch, a bit more complex than a sketch, to put it like that, but still simple. And again, it is part of failing small. So if this doesn't work out, you don't have a final prototype that you're failing at. But on this area, I was a bit nervous about it here in Brazil because we've never used it in game development. When it comes to designing a website or designing an application, it's easier to put that on a piece of paper.
Right.
But here, when teaching the combined model and the students having to make a paper prototype of a game, that was a bit more complex than what I had in mind. They did such an amazing job. Besides the fact they were so talented when it came to actually putting ideas on paper and actually making models of it on paper, it seemed like, of course, there were mixed feedback on depending on what type of game they developed. You know, but I think it was so nice for some of them to have a tangible idea of a game, and they even said, oh, it was a lot easier for us to change stuff or add stuff when the user saw it on paper.
Right.
Because it's a matter of perspective of physical things instead of having it all in Figma or in a digital prototyping tool.
Right. Yeah, I feel that was the case with the students that we tried it on. So one good thing about the game development is that we do already have a process for that. It's called the pen and paper prototype.
Yeah.
So some game design studios do that already. So that's something that we kind of use to segue the paper prototype from your methodology into the classroom. But one thing that were concerning to me is that these were students that have never developed a game. So even though the game industry has this process, they have never used it.
Yes.
And we still got amazing results out of it and amazing feedback as well, even though some of them are mixed, but most of them were more positive than I would thought beforehand, right? So I think this also tells us a little bit about the own designer experience, right? So we're talking about a methodology to look at the user experience, but we also have to think about the designer experience, right?
Definitely.
So is it fun for the person to design the product? So I think the paper prototype is kind of a good way to make it more fun.
Introduce some diversity in the way you're developing, because at the end of the day, I am looking at the learning experience of this process, you know, and I want it to be fun and I want it to be engaging for the students that are trying it out. So I think putting, like you said, more diverse methods into it, it's a way to go. But I also think it depends a lot on the students, and in this case on the game they develop, because for some games it wasn't as feasible to put it like that. It's very difficult to put some of the ideas they had on a piece of paper, to be completely honest.
Yeah, that's a challenge sometimes.
Yeah.
And we know we have some groups that just to run the game have 6 students, right? Yeah. One of them controlling the boss enemy, the other one controlling status and things like that. So that can be hard.
But still, it was incredibly cool to see, from my perspective at least. Yeah. I think it does also have to do with the fact that the process itself, I am aware that at the end, when they go into the industry, they might not use the full thing step by step on a continuous basis. But it serves as a toolbox for them to be able to say, okay, for this project, this part makes sense. Or for this project, we need something else, or I have these 3 tools and I can choose one of them. Because at the end of the day, they just need to be aware of the options that they have when they're designing.
Interesting, yeah. So what are the next steps? So what do you want to go next with this methodology, with your research?
So right now we have collected some feedback from here in Brazil, and probably some iterations of the process will follow. We've also just last semester put up a website that has all the material on it, so it can be easier to teach and it can be easier for students to reference it back and forth when it comes to exam sessions or to anything like that. And iterating the website as well, because we've gathered feedback on that, very user-centric, of course. So we're iterating the process. Next semester we are teaching it again in Reykjavik University, and we're also teaching it in Finland in a different format, just to see which one works better for the students and the professors. And to be completely honest, something that I would really like to do is work with neurodivergency and how that affects the learning in this case. Because there is something to be said about the different needs of students with ADHD or with different types of needs, to put it like that, and how they acquire knowledge. So I would be interested in going more into that part of it as well.
Interesting, yeah. It's good because games are a very good way of teaching neurodiverse people because of the repetition and things like that. So there has been some research around that area that's very promising. So we might want to try that.
So maybe we're working again together, yeah.
Well, I think something interesting about this conversation, we need to collaborate more. So it's very good to see how we can do a research collaborating with a girl from Romania that is working in Iceland, and we're here in Brazil. And something really interesting is not only the research, but we can look more for more things. I need to thank you both, because you helped me to give to my students the opportunity to have a project management course really different. They really do a project management developing a game. So it's a very interesting experience for computer students developing a game during 2 months.
Right.
Yeah. So most of them never developed a game. So it was really interesting, this experience. I know they learn a lot about design, they learn a lot about management, and you both help a lot of this.
And we learned a lot as well.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
It's a win-win.
Yeah.
So thank you both for to be here in Open Univesp. E obrigado a todos, então. É isso.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.